Hello, you're listening to Conversing the Classics. One of the earliest surviving examples of the Greek language in writing is out of the Mycenaeans. The Linear B script survives on tablets far from the Greek we're familiar with. These tablets do not tell tales of heroes, but rather allow us an insight into the stocks and accounts of the Mycenaean palaces. Its decipherment in the 1950s by a British architect is widely regarded as one of the most important linguistic breakthroughs in the 20th century. Joining me today to discuss Linear B is Dr. Anna Judson, Research Fellow at Gonville and Keys College, Cambridge. Anna, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you.
So, I suppose to put things in context, what period was Linear B used?
The texts we've found so far all date from the end of the Greek Bronze Age. That's around 1400 to 1200 BCE. So that makes them more than 3,000 years old.
Okay. And then I suppose in terms of the language, it is quite similar to Greek, and we'll come on to that. But how exactly is the script structured? How does it work?
Okay, so classical Greek was written with an alphabet where each sign represents a single sound, just like in the alphabet that we all use for English. Linear B works rather differently. Each sign represents a syllable, so that's usually a combination of one consonant plus a vowel, like pa, or ti, or me. There's also signs called ideograms, which represent concepts rather than sounds or words, and these are used for counting items in lists. So if you wanted to record that there were 3 women at the Palace of Knossos, you'd spell out Knossos syllabically as kon or so, and then you'd use the ideogram representing a woman, and then you'd write the number 3.
Okay.
And the picture that's on the screen now is a replica of a tablet from Knossos. It's got a short syllabic heading giving a location on Crete, and then it has a series of these ideograms representing various different animals. So there are male and female sheep, goats, pigs, and cattle. And the circles, horizontal lines, and vertical lines are the numbers, and they represent hundreds, tens, and units. So the first entry says 60 male sheep, for example.
Okay. Now, I'm in fear of using the wrong term. What sort of literature survives in it, even though it's not really literature? I mean, what kind of stuff do we have, and how much of it?
Sure. So Linear B was used pretty much exclusively for administrative purposes. So the tablets record goods being contributed to the palaces, or goods that the palaces are distributing to workers, for example, or people participating in festivals, that kind of thing. The texts are usually pretty laconic. They're often just lists of items without really any indication of what they're for, what these items are being used for, why they're being distributed. So this tablet, which is also a replica, is a long list of men who are working for the Palace of Knossos, for example. But each entry actually just has a man's name, followed by the ideogram representing a man, and then the number 1. So we don't actually know what work these people were doing or why they're being recorded here.
And do we find kind of with the tablets the kind of stocks that were with them? Like, would you find sort of a tablet next to sort of a sheep pen or something like that, like they would be, or would they just be in the palace as purely administrative?
Sometimes it varies. There are instances where we found tablets that record oil, for example, perfumed oil being distributed. This was often used as an offering to gods, or it was given out to various people for various purposes. And in the Palace of Pylos, for example, on the mainland, there are tablets recording oil that have been found in rooms alongside pots that would have contained the oil. But in other contexts, you might simply have a large collection of tablets all stored together in one place where the scribes would have been working on those tablets, and not necessarily in the place where the sheep, for example, would be.
And do we have any idea, this is a slightly left of field question, but as to the kind of people who would learn the script, would you have a specific kind of scribe within the palace, or would most sort of educated upper class Mycenaeans have had some grasp, or do we know?
Certainly the number of people who can read and write will have been extremely limited. The vast majority of people will never have seen writing, probably never knew that writing existed. Within the palaces, there's a relatively small number of people. So at Pylos, for example, we think there are about 25 different scribes, maybe a few more. At Knossos, I think there are a few more than that, perhaps 30 or 40. And these will have been elite members of the society. Quite who they are, we're not entirely certain. It could be that they're sort of professional scribes, their job is to keep the records, or it could be that as well as doing the writing, they're actually more like bureaucrats who are sort of managing different aspects of the economy. So you might have somebody in charge of overseeing perfumed oil being produced, and then also keeping the records of that, or that person overseeing the oil being produced might have had a scribe following them around, writing the tablets. We're not entirely sure.
Yeah, but then I suppose the big question, because most people will be familiar with the Greek of Homer and Herodotus. What makes it so different from that kind of Greek that we're familiar with?
Well, apart from the difference of the script, the language is just a lot older. So the Homeric poems, we're not entirely certain of the date in which they were composed, but probably sometime around the 8th century BCE, give or take. Herodotus is from the 5th century. The Linear B texts are from the 14th and the 13th centuries. So there's a lot of changes that can happen to a language in that period of time, if you think about Shakespeare compared to modern English, say. So for one example, the title of the ruler of a Mycenaean palace is the Wanax, meaning something like the king, and it's the same word as the classical Greek word anax, which means lord. It can be applied to people or gods at that point. But in the meantime, between these two periods, the Greek language has lost the sound W. So the form of the word has changed.
And then what are the origins of the script? Surely, so it's obviously sort of a prototype form of the later ancient Greek, but what are its origins, or do we know? Is there any way of telling?
Linear B is related to two earlier Cretan scripts. So these are called Cretan hieroglyphic and Linear A. And these have a similar sort of structure. They have syllabic signs, they have ideograms. Many of the signs look the same in all three of the scripts. But Cretan hieroglyphic and Linear A are undeciphered still. We don't know what language or possibly languages they were used to write. Whereas Linear B seems to have been adapted directly from Linear A in order to write in Greek. Maybe sometime in the 16th or 15th century BC. We're not entirely certain because we haven't got any texts going back that far. And we don't know exactly where this happened either, although Knossos or some other site on Crete seems a likely possibility.
And do you think we'll ever decipher the likes of Linear A, or is it really lost to the ages?
The problem is that we have very little Linear A and even less Cretan hieroglyphic. And the Linear A that we have is even more laconic than the Linear B that we've got. There are very few things that look like they could be full sentences. Most things are, again, just lists, and when you just mostly have lists, you have very little way of trying to access the linguistic information to try and work out what the language is. To some extent, we may be able to read Linear A because enough of the signs seem very similar to Linear B signs that it seems likely that many of them have similar values in both scripts. The problem is that even if you assume that, what comes out of the Linear A texts doesn't really look like any language that we know enough about to identify it.
And then I suppose bringing it back to Linear B, was Linear B only used on Crete, or was it more widespread?
No, so Linear B has been found at a couple of sites on Crete, so Knossos and Hania, but also several sites on the Greek mainland. So Knossos is the largest site in terms of number of tablets. There are about 3,500 tablets from there. The next largest is Pylos from the mainland. That's got about 1,000 tablets. Then Thebes has about 400, and Mycenae has about 80. After that, the numbers get very small, just one or two from individual sites.
So that's a huge amount of kind of tablets. Obviously, we have a great catalogue of what the palaces were using and what kind of supplies they had.
Absolutely, yeah. And the advantage of having such big records, particularly from Knossos and Pylos, is that you can, even though the texts themselves are so kind of small, often fragmentary, quite laconic, when you have hundreds of texts dealing with the same kind of area, you can start to get a much bigger picture. So, for instance, we know that textile production was a really major industry for the Palace of Knossos because we've got hundreds of records listing flocks of sheep all over the central and western parts of Crete. We've got tablets recording wool being delivered to the palace, textiles being produced, textiles being stored in the palace, rations being issued to the women who were weaving and dyeing and decorating these textiles.
And then, I suppose, moving on, the other really famous part of the script comes in terms of its modern history. When was Linear B first discovered today? Well, not today, but in modern academia.
Yeah. So the first discoveries came from Knossos, and this site was excavated and partially reconstructed by the British archaeologist Arthur Evans from around 1900 onwards. And the photo on the screen now shows some of the reconstructed buildings around the palace's central courtyard. The first mainland tablets were found much later. Those are at Pylos in 1939, and there have been periodic discoveries at various different places ever since. Most recently, new tablets have actually been found just in the last couple of years at a newly discovered Mycenaean palace at a place called Aios Vasileios, which is near Sparta. So there's still discoveries being made.
And moving on then from that, possibly the most well-known aspect of Linear B is its decipherment in, I think it's the 1950s, I'm not sure if I got the date right, by the British architect Michael Ventris. But there were other scholars whose work contributed towards the decipherment. Can you tell us about them?
So some of the most important work was initially done by two American classicists called Emmett Bennett and Alice Kober. So Bennett did a lot of the fundamental work analysing and classifying the different signs of the script, because if you don't know whether two signs that look quite similar are actually slightly varying forms of one sign, so they stand for the same sound, or they're actually two different signs and stand for two different sounds, then you can't really make any progress with trying to decipher the script. And Kober was the one who really established the methodology that enabled the script eventually to be deciphered. So even without knowing or trying to establish the actual sound values of any of the signs, she demonstrated that it was possible to identify which signs might share similar values. They might have the same consonant but different vowels, or the same vowel but different consonants. And then finding out the value of one of those signs would thus provide information about the values of other signs. And so in theory, identifying just a relatively small number of values could have a kind of knock-on effect of letting you unlock this information about the script as a whole. Sadly, Kober died quite young in 1950, so she didn't live to see the eventual decipherment.
And it's interesting that Ventris himself wasn't a classicist. Do you know how he got interested in?
So he famously met Arthur Evans, the excavator of Knossos, when he was at school. He was about 14, I think. And his school went on a trip to an exhibition about some of the finds from Knossos and bumped into Arthur Evans in the gallery. And Evans sort of showed them around and told them about the finds and so on, and showed them the Linear B tablets in the case. And I think one of Ventris's teachers later told the story of, a small voice sort of pipes up from the back saying, "Did you say the tablets haven't been deciphered yet, sir?" And that's 14-year-old Michael Ventris, and that was it, really. He would have studied Greek and Latin at school, but no, he wasn't a classicist. He trained as an architect. He was a RAF navigator during the Second World War and then practiced as an architect after that.
But he was obviously an incredibly talented linguist.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And then with that information, obviously from Kober's work and others, and his interest, how did he manage to decipher this almost seemingly undecipherable script?
So through a combination of incredibly detailed analysis of the script, of the kind that Kober had done, and also some very lucky guesses, essentially. He guessed that certain words, which often seem to appear in the headings of tablets from Knossos, might be place names, because that seems like a logical thing that you have as your heading to say this stuff is at this place. And he thought, well, perhaps some of these place names might be the same names that people already knew from later classical sources. So, for instance, a good candidate seemed like Amnisos, which was the name of the harbour of Knossos later on. And he had some other evidence that made him think he might know which signs stood for the syllables a and ni. And using that, he found a word that might stand for aminiso, which is how you'd spell amnisos in this syllabic spelling. And using Kober's methodology, he was then able to use those signs to assign values to other signs and start to try and read more words. And once he did that, he very quickly kind of realised, first of all, that he'd managed to get the correct, this time after many, many attempts that hadn't been successful, he'd managed to get the correct values, and he also realised what language he was actually dealing with. So in July 1952, which is only a few months after he's initially made this guess about the place names, he's been asked to give a talk on the BBC, on the third programme, which is now Radio 3. And he made an announcement saying, "I've suddenly come to the conclusion that the Knossos and Pylos tablets must, after all, be written in Greek."
Wow. And how, obviously it was a few months after he had this realisation, but how long was he working on the script before he finally started to make these breakthroughs?
On and off for a very long time. He'd had an article published about it when he was 19, I think, which was mostly nonsense, as he himself, said a few years later. But nonetheless, he had been working on it, obviously with various other things like his architectural work and the war intervening. His really serious period of work was from about 1948, 49 to 52 when he deciphered it. So it was really quite a short but quite an intense period. He had the end of 1949, he wrote to a bunch of scholars all around the world who were working on Linear B, and he sent them a questionnaire with about 20 questions saying, please can you give me your responses to for instance, how you think the Linear B script is structured, what language you think it might be, all sorts of different pieces of information. And he gathered all these together and circulated it as what he called his mid-century report to all of these scholars, with his own views added as well. And this was meant to be his sort of bowing out, actually. He said in the end of his report, I don't really have time for this anymore. I'm going to let other people take over, but I wanted this to be my contribution of kind of bringing different people's views together. That didn't really work. He obviously tried to give up Linear B and couldn't, and went back to it quite soon after.
Obviously, after he's on but after he was on the radio and made this great announcement, what happened after it? I mean, how did that affect?
Well, one of the people who heard the broadcast was a young classicist called John Chadwick, and he was just about to start his first lecturing job at Cambridge, where he was going to be teaching, amongst other things, the history of the Greek language. And he got in touch with Ventris, asked to see his working, spent about 3 or 4 days reading through his notes, and was convinced pretty much straight away that the decipherment had to be correct. Chadwick had actually worked in cryptanalysis, and so he knew what a code that's sort of on the verge, is in the process of being broken looks like. And he also knew exactly,
he would have worked at Bletchley Park.
He did work at Bletchley Park. He was initially in the Navy, and then he was sent to Bletchley Park later on.
Wow.
So, yes, and actually Bennett as well, one of the American scholars, he had worked in cryptanalysis too.
Okay.
So there's quite a close connection between, the decipherment of Linear B and cryptanalysis.
Wow, brilliant. And then I suppose just on kind of a personal note, you obviously teach Linear B within the University of Cambridge. Is it more, for example, as an undergraduate, is it more difficult to learn Linear B than it is to learn Greek, or ancient Greek, I should say?
Well, it's more difficult to learn the script because there are more signs. The Greek alphabet has 24 letters. It doesn't take that long to learn that. Whereas Linear B has 87 syllabic signs and a couple of hundred ideograms. So simply learning what all the symbols look like obviously takes longer. And then, of course, if you read a piece of Greek literature, you're reading that in an edited version that's been sort of tidied up. Other people have made decisions about what the punctuation should be, if there are uncertain readings, people have made decisions about that. If you read a Linear B text, of course, there are editions that have been published, and again, people have made these editorial decisions, but very often you're looking at pictures, drawings, photographs of the original tablets, and if there's an uncertain sign, you have to make up your own mind what you think that sign is and how that affects the reading of the tablet.
And do you think, this is again another sort of odd question, but do you think there is the possibility that there is something other than catalogues out there, that there might be a piece of actual literature, or is that out of the question?
Literature at this point would really have been oral poetry. So the Homeric poems obviously get written down at some point much later on, but when they were originally composed, they're really part of a tradition of oral poetry. It's a bit controversial whether Homer, if Homer even really existed, was somebody who would have been able to write or dictate to someone who could have written it, but regardless, there are centuries of oral poetic composition behind them, and that must have existed in the Mycenaean period, probably even before the Mycenaean period, but we don't have any real trace of it, because that, as far as we can see, nothing was ever really written in Linear B apart from these administrative documents. There are very few possible exceptions to that. There's a group of jars which are used for transporting oil, probably, which have inscriptions painted on them, and some people have seen those as being an exception to... And
what do the inscriptions, what kind of things are on them? What do they say?
Oh, they're very boring, really. they have a person's name, a place name.
Okay.
Is really all most of the time. And some people have seen those as sort of being a little bit like trademarks. Other people have seen them as being a sort of, it's a prestigious thing to have writing on a pot. Really, in most cases, I would say this is likely to be administrative. The formatting of them seems to be comparable to the formatting of tablets from Knossos, and these all come from Crete. So probably these are just another example of the administrative use of Linear B.
Yeah. And just one last kind of interesting, I've looked a bit at cuneiform and the cuneiform scripts. Is the way you write Linear B the same with these sort of soft clay tablets with a little sort of a triangular...
So it's similar in the tablets are made of clay, but you wouldn't have a sort of wedge-shaped stylus that you impress in the same way. You'd have a quite sharp stylus that you drag through the clay. The reason it's called Linear B is that Arthur Evans, who was the first discoverer, looked at it and said, well, Cretan hieroglyphics, so one of these other two scripts, looks quite pictorial. It's not, it's not a picture writing system. It's nothing to do with Egyptian hieroglyphics, really, but a lot of the signs look quite like pictures. So he called that Cretan hieroglyphic, and then linear A and B look much more stylized, abstract. They're made up of lots of lines. They're called linear.
Okay. Well, then, sort of to sum it all up, if there were only, and this is the question everyone hates, because it's always so specific, if there were only 3 things I could take away from the discussion on linear B, what would you like them to be?
Okay. Well, I guess the first one is the story of how linear B was deciphered is a wonderful story. But I think it's a wonderful story for different reasons from what people often think about it. Because it's often told the story of this sort of lone genius, Michael Ventris, who goes and cracks this undecipherable code. To me, it's a story about how actually being a lone genius isn't really enough. You can't just go and be a lone genius and never sort of collaborate with anybody else. You need, well, first of all, you need a lot of patience and a lot of hard work and just some luck, because luck does play a big part, actually, in the decipherment. And you also need this kind of cooperation with other people with different skills or different perspectives that Ventris really championed and that his work was based on, because without Alice Kober's work beforehand, the script would not have been deciphered, for instance. And he spent his entire time that he was working on Linear B writing to other people all over the world, getting their views, testing out his theories. And that to me is what really any kind of academic study ought to be about. And when Mycenaean studies is kind of at its best, that's what it still is, because in some ways we have such limited evidence. A few thousand tablets sounds like a lot, but really when it comes down to it, it's not. If you think about the whole of classical Greek literature, compared to the amount of text we actually have on these very small tablets, the amount of words we have is tiny. But the time that you get really interesting and exciting results is that when you get classicists and linguists and archaeologists all working together on these very small bits of evidence to try and get as much out of them as we can. So that was point number 2, I think. And the last thing I'd say is that, Linear B, it's 3,000 years old, and it's, bits of clay, mostly about sheep. Why should anybody care, right? Well, because it gives us this wonderful sort of window onto these people who are writing these texts, 3,000 years ago. They can be frustratingly short. There can be so little information that you think, why couldn't they have just written more explanation of why they were writing these things? But even so, when we put all of this evidence together and when we incorporate archaeological evidence from the palaces where they were found, for example, we can learn so much about how these people lived and how they worked. And we even have handprints from the people who made the tablets. We have doodles that scribes drew on the backs of tablets when they were bored. It's a really fantastic connection in that way. When you get to hold one of these tablets and you can see the finger marks that someone's made while writing it, and you think, I'm holding this, and that was a person 3,000 years ago, it's pretty special, actually. And there are new discoveries that we're making all the time, and that might be actually finding new tablets and digging them up, like at Ios Basileos, or it might be new ways of looking at the tablets that we've got to see how they can tell us more about the Mycenaeans. That's brilliant. Well, that brings us really nicely to the end of the podcast. Anna, thank you so much for joining me today and engaging in an excellent discussion and giving me an excellent insight into the world of Linear B. Thanks very much, Oscar. And if you at home enjoyed today's podcast and want to find out more about the work we do, get in touch via our social media outlets, Facebook, Classical Youth Society of Ireland. You can follow us on Twitter @CYSI_, or you can send us an email, cysiofficial@gmail.com. This series of Conversing the Classics was made possible by the Classical Association of Ireland. Today's episode was edited by Michael Fuller. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll catch you all next time.